Imagine a grand colonial wedding where the music echoes through a stately mansion, guests dance in blissful ignorance, and the bride, trapped below in a sealed basement, fights for her life against a chilling conspiracy. This is the dark tale of Elizabeth Harrington, whose wedding night in 1789 became a nightmare orchestrated by those closest to her. Buckle up for a journey into one of the most shocking inheritance schemes in colonial Virginia history. Let's dive into the sinister secrets of Harrington Hall. The screams from beneath Harrington Hall stopped at exactly 23 minutes past midnight on November 7, 1789. For 2 hours and 43 minutes, wedding guests had danced above while Elizabeth Harrington clawed at brick walls in the sealed basement below, her ivory satin gown torn and bloodied from desperate attempts to escape her tomb. What the 52 wedding guests never knew was that they had been dancing on the grave of the bride herself, celebrating a union that had been designed from the very beginning to end in murder. The conspiracy involved not just her husband-to-be, but her own father, her uncle, and 3 prominent Williamsburg families who had orchestrated the most elaborate inheritance scheme in colonial Virginia history. Each conspirator stood to gain thousands of pounds from Elizabeth's death, while she would disappear forever beneath the granite foundation of her childhood home. Elizabeth Harrington possessed something that made her the most valuable and dangerous young woman in all of Williamsburg. A fortune worth over £15,000 inherited directly from her maternal grandfather's shipping empire. At 21, she stood to inherit additional properties in Richmond and Boston upon her marriage, making her one of the wealthiest heiresses in the Tidewater region. But Elizabeth was not just wealthy. She was intelligent, independent, and dangerously curious about the family business dealings that had created such enormous wealth. The Harrington fortune had been built over 3 generations through maritime trade, real estate speculation, and careful political connections. Elizabeth's grandfather, Captain William Harrington, had established trade routes between the Chesapeake and the Caribbean, accumulating vast wealth through tobacco exports and rum imports. Her father, Edward, had expanded the business into land speculation and banking, making the Harrington name synonymous with success throughout Virginia's colonial society. The Harrington estate sat on a bluff overlooking the James River, a massive Georgian mansion with over 35 rooms, including a granite basement that had been specially constructed with unusually thick walls that would prove to be soundproof. The house had been designed by a prominent Boston architect in 1769, incorporating the latest in colonial construction techniques. The basement served as both wine cellar and storage area for her father's import business. But its isolated location and solid construction had given Edward Harrington a more sinister idea. Elizabeth had grown up in this house, exploring every room and secret passage that old colonial mansions inevitably contained. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck in damp weather, and which walls carried sound in unexpected ways. This intimate knowledge of her home's layout would prove crucial to her survival, though she didn't yet realize it. John Ashford appeared in Williamsburg society during the summer of 1788, presenting himself as a South Carolina tobacco merchant with impeccable credentials and letters of introduction from prominent Charleston families. Tall, handsome, and charming, he quickly became the most sought-after bachelor in the colonial capital. His manners were refined, his conversation intelligent, and his apparent wealth substantial enough to impress even the most demanding colonial mothers with marriageable daughters. But John Ashford was not who he claimed to be. His real name was John Mercer, a former indentured servant from Boston who had served 7 years to a cruel master before disappearing with forged papers and a stolen identity. He had spent months studying the social customs and business practices of South Carolina's tobacco aristocracy, creating a false persona so convincing that even experienced colonial society accepted him without question. John had learned about Elizabeth's wealth through careful research and surveillance, spending weeks in Williamsburg taverns, listening to conversations about local families and their financial standing. He had studied the Harrington shipping business, learning enough about maritime trade to discuss it intelligently with Edward. Most importantly, he had identified Elizabeth as the perfect target, wealthy, young, and isolated by her father's protective nature. The conspiracy began when Edward Harrington found himself facing financial ruin despite his apparent wealth. His shipping business had suffered devastating losses due to British naval interference with American merchant vessels, bad investments in Caribbean rum plantations, and a series of loans to Revolutionary War veterans who had defaulted on their debts. The family fortune existed largely on paper, backed by properties that were heavily mortgaged and ships that had been lost at sea or captured by British privateers. Edward had borrowed heavily against Elizabeth's expected inheritance, using her future wealth as collateral for increasingly desperate business ventures. When those ventures failed, he found himself owing more than £40,000 to creditors who were beginning to demand immediate payment. Bankruptcy would mean not just financial ruin, but potential imprisonment in debtor's prison, a fate that had already befallen several prominent colonial merchants. When John approached Edward with a proposition that summer evening in 1788, the two men discovered they shared a common desperation. John needed access to real wealth to maintain his false identity and escape his criminal past. Edward needed Elizabeth's inheritance to save himself from bankruptcy and potential imprisonment for fraud. The solution was as simple as it was evil. Elizabeth would marry John, and shortly after the wedding, she would die in a tragic accident. John would inherit everything as her widower, then split the fortune with Edward, according to a secret agreement they would draft. But they needed additional help to pull off such an elaborate deception. Edward brought in his brother Charles, a prominent attorney who could handle the legal aspects of the inheritance transfer. Charles Harrington had built a successful law practice in Williamsburg, representing wealthy merchants and plantation owners in complex financial matters. However, he had developed a serious gambling problem that had left him deeply in debt to some very dangerous people. When Edward explained the inheritance scheme, Charles realized it offered his only chance to pay off his debts and save his law practice. The conspiracy expanded to include Dr. Benjamin Foster, a physician who had been treating the Harrington family for years. Dr. Foster had his own reasons for cooperation. He had been secretly selling laudanum and other medicines on the black market to supplement his income, and Edward had discovered this illegal activity. Rather than expose the doctor, Edward proposed a mutually beneficial arrangement. Dr. Foster would provide a false death certificate for Elizabeth, attributing her death to a sudden illness or accident. In return, Edward would keep his illegal drug sales secret. The final member of the conspiracy was Nathaniel Brooks, a local magistrate who could ensure no uncomfortable questions were asked about Elizabeth's sudden demise. Brooks had served as a judge in Williamsburg for over a decade, but his position was largely ceremonial, and he struggled financially on his modest government salary. When Charles approached him with an offer to share in the inheritance scheme, Brooks saw an opportunity to secure his financial future and agreed to participate. As autumn approached, Elizabeth began to notice strange conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms. She observed private meetings between her father and John, always conducted in hushed tones behind closed doors. Her natural curiosity, combined with her sharp intelligence, made her increasingly suspicious of the hasty wedding arrangements and the unusual number of legal documents that required her signature. Elizabeth had always been an observant young woman, trained by years of helping her father with his business correspondence to notice details and inconsistencies. She began keeping a private journal, recording the strange behaviors she witnessed and the conversations that seemed to end whenever she appeared. Her entries grew increasingly worried as the wedding date approached, though she couldn't yet understand the true scope of the danger she faced. November 7th dawned gray and cold, with a bitter wind blowing off the James River that seemed to penetrate the very stones of Harrington Hall. The sky was the color of pewter, and the trees surrounding the estate had already lost most of their leaves to an unusually harsh early autumn. Elizabeth woke before dawn, not from excitement about her wedding day, but from a recurring nightmare that had plagued her for weeks. Dreams of being trapped in darkness, calling for help that never came. The nightmare was always the same. She found herself in a stone chamber with walls that seemed to close in around her, while voices she recognized but couldn't identify discussed her fate in whispers just beyond her hearing. She would wake with her nightgown soaked in perspiration, her heart racing as if she had been running for her life. This morning the dream had been more vivid than ever, and Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow prophetic. As her maid Mary helped her into the elaborate ivory satin gown that had belonged to 3 generations of Harrington brides, Elizabeth noticed something that chilled her more than the November air. The dress had been altered significantly, but not for fit. Someone had sewn heavy lead weights into the hem and sleeves. The weights were small and carefully concealed, but Elizabeth could feel their presence as they pulled at the fabric with each movement. When she questioned Mary about this unusual modification, the girl's face went pale, and she stammered that Mr. Edward had ordered it to make the dress hang more elegantly. But Mary's explanation didn't make sense. The weights made the dress heavier and more difficult to move in, not more elegant. Elizabeth filed this detail away in her mind, adding it to the growing list of things about this wedding that didn't seem right. The morning ceremony proceeded without incident in the drawing room of Harrington Hall, witnessed by 52 guests from Williamsburg's most prominent families. The room had been decorated with autumn flowers and greenery, creating a festive atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the gray weather outside. Reverend Samuel Pierce performed the service, unaware that he was officiating at what amounted to a funeral. The Reverend had known Elizabeth since she was a child and had watched her grow into an intelligent, strong-willed young woman. He noticed that she seemed unusually subdued during the ceremony, but attributed it to natural nervousness. Elizabeth noticed that John seemed unusually nervous, sweating profusely despite the cool weather and stumbling over his vows. His hands shook as he placed the ring on her finger, and his voice cracked when he promised to love and protect her until death parted them. Her father appeared distracted, checking his pocket watch repeatedly, as if anxious for the ceremony to conclude. Charles stood near the back of the room, his face grave and pale, while Dr. Foster and Nathaniel Brooks exchanged meaningful glances that Elizabeth couldn't interpret. During the wedding breakfast, Elizabeth noticed that the usual joy and celebration seemed forced. Guests complimented the food and decorations, but their conversation seemed stilted and artificial. Several times she caught people staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite read, not the usual admiration or envy she was accustomed to, but something that looked almost like pity. The breakfast featured all of Elizabeth's favorite foods: fresh oysters from the Chesapeake, roasted pheasant with blackberry sauce, corn pudding, and pumpkin pie. But despite the elaborate spread, she found she had no appetite. The lead weights in her dress made every movement exhausting, and she began to suspect that they served a purpose beyond mere aesthetics. As the morning progressed, Elizabeth overheard fragments of conversation that increased her unease. Guests were discussing travel plans and business matters with unusual urgency, as if they expected to leave Williamsburg quickly. Several mentioned being called away on urgent business the next day, which seemed like an odd coincidence given that it was a Sunday. It was during the wedding breakfast that Elizabeth overheard the conversation that changed everything. She had stepped into the adjacent study to retrieve a handkerchief when she heard her father's voice through the thin wall that separated the study from his private office. He was speaking with John and someone else, a voice she recognized as her Uncle Charles. "The basement is prepared," Edward was saying. "We've moved all the wine barrels to create space, and Nathaniel has brought the materials we discussed. The granite walls are perfect for our purposes. Once the dancing begins and the guests are properly intoxicated, we'll proceed as planned." John's voice was shaky with nervousness. "Are you certain the walls are thick enough? What if someone hears something?" "I supervised the building of this house 20 years ago," Charles replied. "Those basement walls are 3 feet thick, built into the natural granite of the bluff. A cannon could fire down there, and no one upstairs would hear it. The acoustics are perfect for containing sound." Elizabeth pressed her ear closer to the wall, her blood turning to ice as she realized they were discussing some kind of imprisonment. But whose imprisonment, and why? "We'll tell the guests." She became overwhelmed and retired to her room with a headache, her father continued. "By morning, when people expect to see her, we'll have the story prepared about her running away with that fictional lover we've invented." The words hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. They were talking about her. Her own father, her new husband, and her uncle were planning something terrible that would require her to disappear from her own wedding reception. Elizabeth forced herself to continue listening, even as panic began to overwhelm her rational thinking. "The lead weights in the dress will help," she heard her father continue. "When we eventually find her body in the river, it will appear she drowned herself in shame after abandoning her new husband." The full horror of their plan became clear as Elizabeth listened to every devastating detail. They planned to wait until the evening dancing reached its peak, when the guests would be drunk on her father's finest wine and distracted by the celebration. John would suggest that Elizabeth was feeling faint and needed to rest in the cool basement for a few minutes. Once down there, they would overpower her, and Nathaniel Brooks, who had apparently brought masonry tools hidden in his carriage, would brick up the basement entrance while the other guests danced overhead. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with the conspirators discussing timing, alibis, and the distribution of her inheritance. Elizabeth learned that her father owed enormous sums to creditors who had threatened violence if not repaid immediately. John needed her money to establish himself permanently as a South Carolina gentleman, and Charles required funds to pay gambling debts that could cost him his law practice or worse. Fighting panic, Elizabeth forced herself to listen to every detail, knowing that her survival might depend on understanding their plan completely. She learned that they had been preparing for weeks, moving wine barrels to create space in the basement, bringing in masonry supplies under the pretense of repairs, and carefully timing the murder to coincide with the wedding celebration when all the witnesses would be drunk and distracted. When the conversation ended and she heard footsteps approaching the door, Elizabeth quickly moved away from the wall and pretended to be searching through the desk drawers for her handkerchief. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely control them, but she forced herself to appear calm as John entered the study. "There you are, my dear," he said with that charming smile she had once found so attractive, now recognizing it as the expression of a predator preparing to strike. "The guests are asking for you." Elizabeth managed to smile back, though she felt as if her face might crack from the effort. "Of course," she said. "I was just looking for my handkerchief." As they returned to the wedding breakfast, Elizabeth's mind raced through possible escape plans, but she was surrounded by 52 witnesses, many of whom were family friends who trusted her father implicitly. Even if she tried to explain what she had overheard, who would believe such an incredible accusation? And if she tried to run, where could she go? John would simply claim she had become hysterical, and her father would support his story. The afternoon reception continued with Elizabeth playing the role of happy bride, while her mind raced through every possible means of escape or survival. She smiled and accepted congratulations, danced the traditional wedding dances, and laughed at her new husband's jokes, all while knowing that he intended to murder her before dawn. The lead weights in her dress made every movement exhausting, and she realized they had been added not for appearance, but to make it impossible for her to run or fight effectively. The basement of Harrington Hall had always been Elizabeth's least favorite part of the house, even as a child. Built into the natural granite of the bluff, it maintained a constant temperature of 50-degree year-round, making it perfect for wine storage but uncomfortably cold for human habitation. The walls sweated moisture continuously, creating an atmosphere that was both damp and oppressive. The single narrow window at ground level provided minimal light even during the brightest summer days, and at night the basement became a realm of deep shadows and echoing sounds. Elizabeth remembered childhood games of hide-and-seek that had taken her into the basement, where she had discovered that the granite construction created strange acoustic effects. Certain spots near the walls could amplify voices, sending them up through the house's structure to unexpected locations. Other areas seemed to swallow sound completely, creating pockets of eerie silence even when the house above was full of activity. What Elizabeth didn't know was that her father had been preparing this space for weeks, ever since finalizing the murder plot with his fellow conspirators. Under the pretense of reorganizing the wine cellar to make room for new shipments, Edward had systematically moved dozens of bottles and barrels to create an open area near the far wall. The space he created was roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, large enough for a person to stand and move around, but small enough to be easily sealed with a brick wall. Edward had also installed additional ventilation that could be easily sealed, ostensibly to better preserve his most expensive wines. In reality, he had been calculating how long someone could survive in the sealed space, ensuring that Elizabeth would live long enough to suffer, but not long enough to be rescued. The ventilation would provide perhaps 3 to 4 hours of breathable air, enough time for the wedding guests to become thoroughly intoxicated and for the conspirators to establish their alibis. The granite walls that made the basement ideal for wine storage would also make it the perfect tomb. The thick stone would muffle any sounds Elizabeth might make, while the natural dampness would accelerate the effects of cold and dehydration. Edward had researched the effects of imprisonment in sealed spaces, consulting medical texts in his library, under the pretense of curiosity about mining accidents and cave-ins. Nathaniel Brooks had arrived 3 hours before the ceremony with a wagon load of masonry supplies, telling anyone who asked that he was planning to help Edward repair some damage to the basement walls after the wedding. The bricks, mortar, and tools were now waiting in the basement, positioned behind empty wine barrels where the wedding guests wouldn't notice them, even if they happened to venture downstairs. Brooks had experience with masonry from his younger days working on construction projects before becoming a magistrate. He had practiced the technique of rapid wall construction, timing himself to see how quickly he could seal an opening. With proper preparation and the right materials, he could complete a wall 6 feet high and 4 feet wide in less than 2 hours. The tools included not just building supplies, but also items that revealed the full extent of their planning. Ropes for restraining Elizabeth if she fought back, laudanum provided by Dr. Foster to drug her if necessary, and even spare clothing to replace their formal wedding attire if it became stained with mortar or blood during the construction process. As evening approached and the guests grew more intoxicated on Edward's finest wines, Elizabeth noticed Nathaniel Brooks making several trips to his carriage, each time returning with what appeared to be tools wrapped in canvas. She observed that he moved with the confident efficiency of someone following a well-rehearsed plan, never hesitating or appearing uncertain about his tasks. Dr. Foster arrived later than the other guests, carrying a black medical bag that seemed unusually heavy. Elizabeth noticed that he avoided her eyes when offering congratulations, and his hands shook slightly when he raised his glass to toast her happiness. The irony of his toast, wishing her a long and prosperous marriage, was lost on the other guests but struck Elizabeth as particularly cruel, given what she now knew. Charles had positioned himself near the basement door throughout the afternoon, casually directing foot traffic away from that area of the house. He engaged guests in conversation whenever they seemed to be wandering toward the basement stairs, always managing to steer them back toward the main reception areas. His behavior seemed natural and social, but Elizabeth recognized it as the careful execution of a predetermined strategy. When the dancing began in earnest around 8 p.m., Elizabeth knew her time was running short. The musicians played popular country dances and minuets, filling the house with music that would help mask any sounds that might come from the basement. The guests had consumed significant quantities of wine and punch, making them less observant and more easily distracted. Elizabeth noticed that the 4 conspirators had positioned themselves strategically around the house. Edward remained near the main reception areas, playing the role of gracious host. Charles continued his subtle guard duty near the basement entrance. Dr. Foster circulated among the guests, engaging them in animated conversations that would provide alibis for all of them. And John stayed close to Elizabeth, ready to execute his part of the plan. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth realized that her only chance of survival lay in understanding every detail of their strategy and finding a way to turn their careful planning against them. She began to study the basement entrance more carefully, noting the heavy wooden door and the stone stairs that descended into darkness. If she was going to be forced down there, she needed to understand the layout and identify any possible advantages. The basement stairs were steep and narrow, with no railing on one side. The steps themselves were carved from the same granite as the walls, worn smooth by decades of use. Elizabeth remembered from childhood explorations that there were several loose stones in the basement walls, places where the original construction had left gaps that could be used as handholds or hiding spots. Most importantly, she remembered the acoustic properties of the basement that had fascinated her as a child. If she could position herself correctly, her voice might carry up through the house's structure to locations where it could be heard by the wedding guests. It was a desperate hope, but it might be her only chance to summon help. John approached Elizabeth with that charming smile she had once found so attractive, now recognizing it as the expression of a predator preparing to strike. The music from the drawing room provided perfect cover for their conversation, and most of the guests were too intoxicated to pay close attention to the bride and groom's movements. "My dear wife," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "You look flushed. Perhaps you should rest for a moment somewhere cooler." Elizabeth felt her heart begin to race, but she forced herself to appear calm. "I feel perfectly well, thank you," she replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her terror. "Nonsense," John insisted, his grip on her arm tightening in a way that appeared affectionate to observers but felt threatening to Elizabeth. The excitement of the day has been overwhelming. A few minutes of quiet will restore your spirits. Several nearby guests overheard this exchange and murmured agreement. "The poor dear does look pale," commented Mrs. Langley, an elderly family friend. "Perhaps some fresh air would help." "I really think some air from the garden would be better," Elizabeth said, trying to steer John toward the French doors that opened onto the terrace. If she could get outside, she might have a chance to escape into the darkness. "The garden is too cold at this hour," John replied firmly. "The basement will be much more comfortable. It's always cool and quiet down there." Elizabeth realized that he was determined to follow the plan regardless of her protests. Any further resistance would only make the other guests suspicious and potentially alert them to something wrong. She would have to go along with his suggestion and hope that she could find some way to escape or summon help once they reached the basement. As they moved toward the basement entrance, Elizabeth noticed that the other conspirators were smoothly moving into position. Charles appeared at her other side, ostensibly to help steady her as they walked. Dr. Foster began a loud, animated discussion with a group of guests near the front of the house, ensuring their attention would be focused away from the basement area. Edward remained visible in the main reception room, establishing his alibi by engaging in conversations that multiple witnesses would remember. The coordination was flawless, the result of careful planning and rehearsal. Elizabeth realized that they had probably run through this scenario multiple times, timing each movement and ensuring that every detail was perfect. They had left nothing to chance except Elizabeth's own response, and they clearly expected her to be too frightened or confused to mount any effective resistance. As they descended the stone steps into the basement, Elizabeth felt the temperature drop with each footfall. The music and laughter from the wedding reception above seemed to fade away, replaced by the hollow echoes of their footsteps on granite. The basement stretched out before them, lit by only a few oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the sweating walls. The familiar smell of wine and damp stone filled Elizabeth's nostrils, but now these scents carried an undertone of menace. She could see the area that had been cleared of wine barrels, creating an open space near the far wall. The suspicious pile of building materials was partially hidden behind empty casks, but Elizabeth's trained eye could identify bricks, mortar, and tools that had no legitimate purpose in a wine cellar. John guided her toward the far end of the basement, where the ceiling was lower and the walls seemed to press in more closely. Elizabeth realized that they had chosen this location carefully. It was the most isolated part of the basement, farthest from the stairs, and least likely to be discovered accidentally. "What is Mr. Brooks doing here?" Elizabeth asked, her voice carefully controlled despite her terror, as Nathaniel emerged from behind a massive wooden cask with masonry tools in his hands. "He's helping your father with some urgent repairs," John said. But his casual tone couldn't hide the nervousness in his voice, and Elizabeth noticed that his hands were shaking. Perspiration beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the basement. At that moment, Edward appeared at the bottom of the stairs, moving with grim determination. Behind him came Charles, and Elizabeth realized with dawning horror that all four conspirators were now in the basement with her, while the wedding guests danced obliviously above. The sound of music and laughter filtered down through the ceiling, but it seemed distant and muffled, as if coming from another world. The basement felt suddenly smaller, as if the walls were closing in around her. Elizabeth could hear her own heartbeat echoing in her ears, and she had to fight against the panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking. She needed to stay calm and alert if she was going to have any chance of survival. "Elizabeth," her father said, his voice heavy with what might have been regret or simply nervousness. "I'm sorry it has come to this." The words confirmed her worst fears. This was really happening. Her own father, the man who had taught her to read and encouraged her independence, stood before her as the architect of her murder. The wedding, the courtship, John's entire presence in her life, everything had been an elaborate charade designed to place her inheritance within their reach. Elizabeth's mind worked with desperate clarity as she absorbed the full scope of the betrayal. She thought of all the times her father had spoken about protecting her, about ensuring her future happiness and security. She remembered his advice about choosing a husband carefully, about the importance of marrying for both love and financial stability. Now she understood that every conversation had been part of a larger deception designed to make her trust John and accept the hastily arranged wedding. "You don't have to do this," she said, backing away from the four men, but knowing there was nowhere to run in the confined basement. "I'll sign whatever documents you want. You can have the money. I don't need it." Edward shook his head sadly, but Elizabeth could see calculation rather than genuine remorse in his eyes. "It's too late for that, daughter. Too many people are involved now. Too many debts that need to be paid immediately. Your death has to appear accidental, and that requires this." John had produced a length of rope from behind one of the wine barrels, and Elizabeth realized they had planned every detail of her murder. They intended to bind her before beginning the masonry work, ensuring she couldn't interfere with the construction of her tomb. The rope was thick and strong, designed to hold her no matter how desperately she struggled. Elizabeth realized that her only advantage lay in her intimate knowledge of the basement from childhood explorations. As a girl, she had discovered that several of the granite blocks in the basement wall were loose, creating small hiding places where she had stored childhood treasures. More importantly, she had learned that sound carried strangely in the basement due to natural acoustics in the stone. Certain spots near the walls could amplify voices, sending them up through the house's structure to unexpected locations. As John approached with the rope, Elizabeth moved to one of these acoustic spots and did something that caught all four men off guard. She began to scream, not in panic, but with calculated purpose. Her voice, trained by years of singing in the church choir, rang out with surprising volume and clarity, designed to carry through the stone walls and up into the house above. "Help me! John Ashford is trying to murder me. Father is trying to kill me for my inheritance. They're going to seal me alive in this basement. Help!" The four men lunged toward her simultaneously, but Elizabeth had positioned herself strategically. The heavy lead weights in her wedding dress, instead of hindering her movement as intended, became weapons. She swung her weighted sleeves like clubs, striking John across the face with enough force to break his nose. Blood spurted down his white shirt as he stumbled backward into Brooks, causing both men to crash into a rack of wine bottles. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the basement as dozens of bottles shattered, sending wine and fragments of pottery across the stone floor. The noise was loud enough to potentially be heard upstairs, and Elizabeth hoped it might alert someone to trouble in the basement. Charles reached her first, clamping his hand over her mouth to stop her screaming, but Elizabeth bit down hard enough to taste blood. His scream of pain echoed through the basement as she broke free and continued her strategic shouting, moving to different acoustic spots to maximize the chance that her voice would carry upstairs. "The Harrington fortune is built on lies. They borrowed against my inheritance. They're bankrupt. Send for the sheriff." Above them, the wedding guests continued their celebration, but Elizabeth's desperate gamble began to pay off. Her voice, amplified by the granite walls, carried up through the house's structure to several locations where people could hear something unusual. Mary, the maid who had helped her dress that morning, was cleaning the upper floors when she heard something that made her pause. The sound was faint and distorted, but it seemed like someone calling for help. She moved closer to the floor, pressing her ear against the wooden boards, trying to determine if she was really hearing voices or if it was just the wind outside. Mrs. Thompson, the cook, was working in the kitchen directly above part of the basement when she heard what sounded like shouting. The kitchen was separated from the main reception areas, so the music and conversation from the party didn't mask other sounds as effectively. She stopped her work and listened carefully, becoming increasingly concerned about what she was hearing. In the basement, Edward grabbed a heavy wine bottle and struck Elizabeth across the temple, causing her to collapse to the cold stone floor. Blood trickled down her face, staining the ivory satin of her wedding gown, but she remained conscious and continued to call out whenever possible. "Hurry," Edward ordered, his voice tight with stress. "Some of the servants might have heard something. We need to finish this quickly." Brooks began mixing mortar with practiced efficiency, working faster than he had during his practice sessions. The sound of his trowel scraping against the stone echoed through the basement, adding to the noise that might be heard upstairs. Charles and John dragged Elizabeth toward the far wall, but their victim was far from defeated. As they bound her hands with rope, she managed to tear a piece of lace from her wedding gown and work it between the rope and her wrists. The lace was delicate but slippery, creating just enough slack that she might be able to work free later if given enough time. It was a small advantage, but Elizabeth had learned to value any edge that might help her survive. The sound of the first brick being laid echoed through the basement like a death knell. Elizabeth watched in growing horror as Brooks began constructing a wall that would seal off the far corner of the basement, creating a tomb roughly 6 feet by 8 feet. The space would be large enough for her to stand and move around, but there would be no possibility of escape once the wall was completed. As the wall grew higher, Elizabeth noticed that Brooks was working quickly, too quickly for proper masonry. The mortar between the bricks was uneven, and some of the blocks weren't properly seated. His hands shook from nervousness, and perspiration dripped from his forehead onto the bricks as he worked. The wall would certainly be strong enough to contain her, but the hasty construction might create weaknesses she could exploit. "The guests are asking about Elizabeth," Charles said, glancing nervously toward the stairs. "Someone noticed that she and John have been gone for quite a while. Tell them she's feeling unwell and needs to rest," Edward replied. "Say that John is caring for her and they don't want to be disturbed." But even as he spoke, they could hear footsteps on the floor above and voices that seemed to be asking questions. The wedding celebration was continuing, but some people were clearly becoming curious about the bride's absence from her own reception. The wall was now 3 feet high, and Elizabeth found herself trapped in an increasingly small space as the bricks rose around her. The oil lamp they had left flickered ominously, casting dancing shadows that made her prison seem even smaller. She could see the mortar oozing between the bricks, sealing her fate with each additional layer. Above, the wedding celebration continued with increasing volume as more wine flowed, and the guests grew more intoxicated. But Elizabeth's desperate screams had not gone entirely unheard. Mary, the maid, had mentioned the strange sounds to Mrs. Thompson, the cook, who had also heard something troubling from the kitchen. The two women whispered together, wondering if they should investigate or inform someone in authority. Their conversation was overheard by Reverend Samuel Pierce, the minister who had performed the wedding ceremony. A man of genuine faith and moral conviction, Reverend Pierce had noticed something troubling about the haste of the wedding arrangements and the nervous behavior of the groom throughout the ceremony. When he heard the servants discussing strange sounds from the basement, his suspicions crystallized into action. "Where exactly did these sounds come from?" Reverend Pierce asked Mrs. Thompson quietly, drawing her aside from the other wedding guests. "From below the kitchen, Reverend," she replied, her voice filled with concern. "Sounded like someone calling for help, and there was a terrible crash like breaking glass. But that can't be right. All the wedding guests are here in the drawing room and garden." Reverend Pierce felt a chill of apprehension that had nothing to do with the November weather. As a veteran of the Revolutionary War, he had learned to trust his instincts about danger, and something about this wedding had troubled him from the beginning. The hasty arrangements, John's nervous behavior, and now these reports of distress calls from below the house created a pattern that demanded investigation. "I'm going to look into this," Pierce told Mrs. Thompson. "If someone is in trouble, we need to help them immediately." Pierce excused himself from the celebration and made his way toward the basement stairs, but found his path blocked by Charles Harrington, who appeared with suspicious quickness. "Reverend Pierce, you're missing the finest dancing of the evening," Charles said with forced joviality, positioning himself directly in front of the basement door. "Come, let me get you some more of that excellent Madeira." "I thought I heard something from below," Pierce replied carefully, studying Charles's face for signs of deception. "Perhaps an animal trapped in the cellar." "Oh, that!" Charles laughed nervously, but his eyes darted toward the basement door. "Father is doing some repair work down there with a few of the men. Probably just the sound of hammering. You know how sound carries in these old houses." But Reverend Pierce was not easily deterred. The explanation didn't make sense. What kind of repair work would be done during a wedding reception? And why would it involve breaking glass and what sounded distinctly like human voices calling for help? "I'd like to see this repair work for myself," Pierce said firmly. "As a minister, I have some experience with construction, and I might be able to help." Charles's face went pale, and perspiration began to bead on his forehead despite the cool evening air. "That's very kind, Reverend, but really they have everything well in hand. Why don't we rejoin the other guests?" Meanwhile, in the basement below, the wall was now over 4 feet high enough that Elizabeth could no longer see over it, but not yet high enough to completely seal her in. She could still hear the sounds of construction and the labored breathing of Nathaniel Brooks as he worked frantically to complete her tomb. Elizabeth had been working steadily to loosen the ropes around her wrists, using the piece of lace she had torn from her dress. The rough stone wall behind her provided an abrasive surface, and after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, she felt the rope beginning to give way. The silk lace was delicate but slippery enough to create the small amount of slack she needed. John appeared at the opening of her rapidly shrinking prison, looking down at her with what might have been guilt or simply impatience. His nose was swollen and crooked from where she had struck him with her weighted sleeve, and dried blood stained his white wedding shirt. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "I want you to know this isn't personal. It's just business. Your father's debts are real, and without your inheritance, he faces worse than bankruptcy." "Business?" Elizabeth spat back, her voice hoarse from screaming but still filled with defiance. "You're murdering me for money, and you call it business? You stood before God and promised to love and protect me, and now you're sealing me alive in a tomb." "Your father owes more than you can imagine," John replied, glancing nervously toward the stairs. "The creditors aren't just threatening financial ruin. They've promised violence. This way, at least the family name survives, and your death will be quick." "What family name?" Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "You mean the name of murderers and conspirators? You think anyone will remember the Harringtons as anything but the family that killed their own daughter for money?" Above them, they could hear voices that seemed closer than the general celebration. Someone was asking questions, looking for the bride and groom. The conspirators exchanged worried glances, and Brooks began working even faster, slopping mortar hastily between the bricks. "Where are John and Elizabeth?" they heard a voice ask. "Several people are asking for them." Charles's voice came from the top of the stairs, strained with effort to sound casual. They stepped outside for some fresh air. The bride was feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the attention. But the questioner seemed persistent. "In this cold weather and without their cloaks? That seems unlikely." Elizabeth seized this moment of distraction to make her desperate move. With her hands now free from the loosened ropes, she grabbed a loose piece of granite that had fallen from Brooks's hasty construction and hurled it at the oil lamp. The glass shattered, plunging the basement into almost complete darkness, except for the minimal light filtering down from upstairs. In the sudden darkness, confusion reigned. Elizabeth heard Edward curse loudly, followed by the sound of someone stumbling into the wine barrels. Glass and pottery crashed to the floor as the men blundered around in the darkness, trying to relight the lamp and maintain control of their prisoner. Elizabeth used the noise and confusion as cover to climb onto a wooden crate that brought her high enough to grab the top of the partially completed wall. The bricks were still loose in their hasty mortar, and as she pulled herself up, several of them shifted and fell, creating even more noise and confusion. She managed to get one leg over the wall, just as hands grabbed her other ankle. In the darkness, she couldn't see who was trying to drag her back into her tomb, but she kicked frantically with her free foot, her heavy wedding shoe connecting with something soft that elicited a scream of pain. The sound of falling bricks and Elizabeth's renewed screaming finally penetrated the celebration above. Reverend Pierce, now joined by two other wedding guests who had noticed the bride's prolonged absence, pushed past Charles's increasingly desperate protests and descended the basement stairs. "Stop!" Charles called after them. "You can't go down there. It's dangerous." But his words only confirmed Pierce's suspicions that something was seriously wrong. The Reverend reached the bottom of the stairs and called out into the darkness, "Is someone down here? We heard sounds of distress." A hastily relit lamp revealed a scene of barely controlled chaos. Elizabeth, her ivory wedding gown torn and bloodied, stood balanced precariously on top of a half-built brick wall, pointing accusingly at the four men covered in mortar dust and granite chips, who stood below her like children caught in a forbidden game. "Reverend Pierce," Elizabeth called out, her voice hoarse from screaming but filled with relief. "Thank God you came. They're trying to murder me. They built this wall to seal me alive in the basement. John married me to steal my inheritance." The evidence was impossible to deny. The fresh mortar, the building tools scattered across the floor, the partially completed wall that would have created a sealed chamber, Everything confirmed Elizabeth's desperate accusations. The broken glass from wine bottles and the shattered oil lamp bore witness to a struggle, while the rope that had been used to bind Elizabeth lay on the floor near her feet. John made one final desperate attempt at deception, his voice shaking with poorly concealed panic. "She's hysterical," he said, trying to sound concerned rather than guilty. "The excitement of the wedding has affected her mind. We were just trying to help her calm down by bringing her to a quiet place." But his explanation made no sense given the evidence surrounding them. Why would calming a hysterical bride require masonry tools and construction materials? Why was there a half-built wall that seemed designed to create a sealed chamber? And why were all four men covered in mortar dust if they were simply trying to help Elizabeth rest? Brooks, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly broke down under the pressure of discovery and the weight of his own conscience. "I can't do this anymore," he sobbed, his composure completely shattered. "God forgive me. I can't seal a living woman in a tomb. It's murder, plain and simple murder. I never signed up for this." His confession opened the floodgates. Charles tried to maintain the fiction, but Dr. Foster, faced with exposure of his role in the conspiracy and the potential loss of his medical license, began revealing details of the plot in a desperate attempt to minimize his own culpability. "I only agreed to provide a death certificate," Dr. Foster said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought they would actually. I thought it would be made to look like an accident. Something quick. Not this. Not sealing someone alive." The full scope of the plot emerged in fragments as each conspirator tried to save himself by implicating the others. Edward had been embezzling from his business partners for years, using Elizabeth's inheritance as collateral for loans he couldn't repay. The family's apparent wealth was largely fictional, built on borrowed money and forged documents. John was indeed a wanted man in Boston, fleeing charges of fraud and theft under his real name of John Mercer. He had spent months researching the Harrington family, identifying Elizabeth as the perfect target for his inheritance scheme. Charles had been disbarred in South Carolina for similar schemes involving inherited estates, and his gambling debts had made him desperate enough to participate in murder. Dr. Foster had been selling laudanum and other medicines illegally, and Edward had used this knowledge to force his cooperation. Elizabeth, still standing on the wall that was meant to be her tomb, looked down at the four men who had planned her death with a mixture of revulsion and pity. Her father, the man who had raised her and claimed to love her, couldn't meet her eyes. John, the man who had spoken wedding vows to her mere hours earlier, was weeping like a child caught in a cruel prank. "The lead in my dress," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite everything she had endured. "You added weight so I couldn't fight back effectively, so I couldn't run. You planned every detail of my murder, down to how my body would look when it was eventually found." Edward finally looked up at his daughter, and for a moment, his mask of justification fell away completely. "The debts, Elizabeth. You don't understand the pressure, the threats. If I couldn't pay them, they would have killed all of us. You, me, Charles. I thought this way at least you would have a quick death and the family could survive. So you chose to murder me rather than face the consequences of your own crimes?" Elizabeth replied, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. "You chose to make me pay with my life for your mistakes, your greed, your cowardice." As more wedding guests descended into the basement, drawn by the commotion and Reverend Pierce's urgent calls for assistance, the full horror of what had been planned became clear to everyone present. The celebration above ground had turned into a scene of shocked whispers and horrified discussions, as word spread through the gathering that the bride had nearly been murdered by her own father and new husband. By midnight on November 7, 1789, what had begun as a wedding celebration had transformed into a criminal investigation and the social scandal of the decade. The four conspirators were placed under citizen's arrest by Reverend Pierce and several other prominent guests to be held until the Williamsburg sheriff could be summoned at first light. The basement of Harrington Hall became a crime scene, carefully preserved by the wedding guests who understood the legal importance of maintaining evidence. The half-built wall, the masonry tools, the ropes used to bind Elizabeth, and even the lead weights sewn into her wedding dress would all serve as proof of the elaborate murder plot. Elizabeth, despite her ordeal, insisted on remaining in the main house to ensure that evidence was preserved and witness statements were properly recorded. She had survived an attempt on her life through intelligence, courage, and desperate determination, and she was not about to let legal technicalities allow her would-be murderers to escape justice. The wedding guests found themselves unwitting witnesses to one of the most elaborate inheritance fraud schemes in Virginia's colonial history. Letters were immediately dispatched to Boston and Charleston, where John's true identity would be confirmed, and additional charges awaited him under his real name of John Mercer. Dr. Benjamin Foster's confession revealed the full extent of his illegal activities, including the sale of laudanum and opium to addiction-prone patients. His medical practice was immediately suspended, and he faced charges not only for conspiracy to commit murder, but for violating his oath as a physician. Nathaniel Brooks's breakdown had exposed corruption in the local magistrate system that went far beyond this single case. His willingness to participate in murder for financial gain raised questions about other cases he had handled, and his position was immediately stripped away pending a full investigation. Charles Harrington's legal career was finished not just in Virginia, but throughout the colonies as word of his crime spread through the interconnected network of colonial attorneys. His gambling debts, which had made him vulnerable to the conspiracy in the first place, would now never be paid, as he faced lengthy imprisonment. As dawn broke over the James River, Elizabeth stood in the drawing room where she had spoken wedding vows less than 24 hours earlier. The ivory satin gown, now stained with blood and granite dust, would never be worn by another Harrington bride. The lead weights that had been sewn into the fabric lay on a table as evidence, their true purpose now understood by everyone who saw them. The Harrington family fortune, such as it was, would be liquidated to pay off Edward's legitimate debts and provide restitution to his victims. The house itself would eventually be sold, though it would be years before anyone could forget what had happened in its basement on that November night. Edward Harrington faced not only charges of attempted murder, but an investigation into his business dealings that revealed years of fraud and embezzlement. The shipping empire that had seemed so successful was revealed to be built largely on forged documents and borrowed money. Multiple colonial families had invested with Edward based on his reputation, only to discover that their money had been used to pay earlier investors in a scheme that would have collapsed even without Elizabeth's murder. John Ashford, whose real name was John Mercer, would be returned to Boston to face charges there, as well as attempted murder charges in Virginia. The elaborate identity he had constructed would be thoroughly dismantled, revealing a pattern of fraud stretching across multiple colonies and involving dozens of victims. The most chilling aspect of the conspiracy was how close it had come to succeeding. If Elizabeth had not overheard the crucial conversation between the conspirators, if she had not possessed the intelligence to understand what she was hearing, if she had not known the acoustic properties of her own house well enough to make her screams heard, any of these factors might have resulted in her death and the successful execution of the inheritance fraud. But perhaps the most significant outcome was what didn't happen. Elizabeth Harrington, by refusing to become a victim, had saved not only her own life, but potentially the lives of future heiresses who might have fallen prey to similar schemes. Her intelligence, courage, and determination to fight even when trapped in what seemed like an impossible situation had exposed a conspiracy that might otherwise have inspired imitators throughout the colonies. The basement of Harrington Hall would eventually be filled in with rubble, the granite walls that were meant to muffle Elizabeth's dying screams, instead becoming a monument to her survival. The house itself would stand for many more years, but the events of November 7th would be remembered long after the building was gone. As Elizabeth later reflected while giving her testimony to colonial authorities, the most chilling aspect of the entire experience was not the physical danger she had faced, but the realization that the people closest to her, her father, her new husband, her uncle, had been capable of such complete betrayal. The wedding that was meant to mark the beginning of her adult life had instead become a test of her will to survive against impossible odds. The conspiracy to murder Elizabeth Harrington failed not because of outside intervention, but because the victim herself refused to cooperate with her own execution. Her story would become a cautionary tale told throughout the colonies, a reminder that greed and desperation could corrupt even the strongest family bonds, and that survival sometimes depended not on physical strength, but on intelligence, courage, and the determination to fight when fighting seemed hopeless. The lead weight sewn into her wedding dress, intended to drag her body to the bottom of the James River, instead became symbols of the careful planning that had gone into her murder. The granite basement that was meant to be her tomb became evidence of a conspiracy that shocked colonial society and changed how inheritance laws were enforced throughout Virginia. Elizabeth's survival had implications far beyond her personal tragedy. Colonial authorities began investigating similar cases throughout the region, discovering that inheritance fraud was more common than previously believed. New laws were enacted requiring multiple witnesses for inheritance transfers, and stricter oversight was established for attorneys handling estate matters. The case of Elizabeth Harrington became a precedent that would be cited in colonial courts for decades to come, establishing legal principles that would eventually influence American inheritance law. Her refusal to become a victim had not only saved her life, but had helped protect countless others from similar schemes. What did you think of this chilling tale from colonial Virginia? Could such a calculated conspiracy really have unfolded in the shadows of a wedding celebration? The intricate planning, the betrayal by those closest to her, and Elizabeth's incredible fight for survival make this story almost too shocking to believe. Yet, the evidence suggests that inheritance fraud was a real threat in an era when women had few legal protections and family loyalty was often assumed to be absolute. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think happened that night at Harrington Hall. If you were gripped by this dark mystery, give us a thumbs up, share this video with a friend who loves historical true crime, and hit that subscribe button with the notification bell to never miss another story. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows of history with us.